You just heard Dragonaut from Sleep's Holy Mountain from 1992. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I am Jason. And we're there, man. We're at what they say the penultimate episode of the Doom series. You can see the doomy light at the end of the tunnel, I guess, here, which is cool. You know, I mean, I can't believe. I think when we sort of started this back in like late spring, the intention was probably, you know, maybe 6 episodes perhaps. And then we just kept having conversations about like what to add to this. I think Sleep was one of the latecomers where I think we both realized like, you know, I think to tell this, you know, myriad kind of multitude of subgenre story of, you know, doom metal in America, you can't avoid Sleep, even though they're somewhat short-lived in a weird way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Short-lived, but incredibly influential. They came out at exactly the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some even cool quotes about that where Pike's like, you know, we quit at the right time, you know? Mm-hmm. So, which is pretty funny, but yeah, so that's kind of like where we're sort of heading here as we kind of go into our series finale, starting with the next episode that you'll hear and stuff. But, basically what you heard there, just to sort of lay out what you heard off Dragonaut, because it kind of does establish a lot of the Sleep stuff. And then we'll kind of, catch up for a moment. But just since it's fresh on people's memory, you know, I mean, the song itself is kind of constructed from a Lord of this World in a riff from Sabbath, along with National Acrobat, which I believe is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And so, yeah, right. I mean, I think that's the thing you're going to sort of get with this band if you're unfamiliar with Sleep, and I doubt there are too many people that are completely unfamiliar. But, you know, I mean, Pike is playing, all those guys are playing in the Sabbath sandbox. I mean, even the title alone is an ode to Supernaut from Volume 4, you know, Dragonaut and stuff.
I mean, so, the vocal effect is the Ozzy kind of
exactly
delivery and everything, which not really anybody was doing that at the time.
No. Even Lee, what he was doing with Cathedral was his own unique take. You know, it wasn't like an Ozzy sort of ode or anything like that. I think the only one that really came closest for me in this era of Ozzy was Christopher from Count Raven. Yeah. He sort of had a natural sort of Ozzy overtone to him and stuff. But, you know, I mean, if we're going to kind of just, this is sort of the template for everything that is Sleep. So if you don't know Sleep, you know, essentially it starts off with a killer Matt Pike, the guitar player, and we'll talk more about him later, you know, Blue Cheer riff basically at the beginning. Yeah. While Al Cisneros kind of goes, Cisneros, I think. Cisneros is how you say that. I didn't check with Matt the proper pronunciation. I should have when I spoke to him. But he goes, you know, full Geezer Butler, you know, psychedelia, very like NIB type kind of bass riffing and stuff.
Yeah.
Chris is playing this sort of sloppy jazz kind of style that Bill Ward kind of perfected and blends together with this sort of, you know, it really comes together, like we said, as this almost American version of a Second Coming of Sabbath formula that few perfected, especially not just in this era, but really as well since.
Yeah, I think, and this was kind of like set up the whole era of, you know, Wizard and that whole slew of, you know, more 70s influence bands, I think, from that stoner area, because it was death metal and then black metal and then this comes out. Yeah. It was like these 3 big things all at once.
Yeah, and it was like, you know, it became this glut thing, and we'll definitely talk about that. But I think, again, few did it as well as Sleep did. And I think, unfortunately, they weren't necessarily appreciated as much at the time that they were doing it, which kind of we'll speak to later throughout the episode as we talk about just the weird, they're almost a little like ahead of the curve every time. And unfortunately, they don't necessarily benefit from it, except maybe in modern times, you know, with like reunions and all of a sudden people really are into what they're doing now. Yeah. It just kind of stunk that they were not as into it maybe back then, you know.
Oh, and there's a lot of record label issues with that too.
Oh, for sure. You know, I mean, you know, the thing is even though they're so bathed in Sabbath and things like that, they still have like a real they kind of maintain a fierce identity that is very singular. You know, it's like, it's Sleep, you know, it's Sleep.
Well, I think a lot of it, at least the tone, a lot of that has to do with Pike's like obsessive 70s tube amplification, you know. Mm-hmm. And it's just like no matter what his tone, it was interesting going back and revisiting some of these older records too, because like Volume 1, I bought when it came out on record, and I never really listened to it much until maybe 15 years after I had it, and then it's been years. I didn't even recognize the record. It's so different, but you could still recognize Pike's approach.
Sure.
His tone, not necessarily as like the riff style, but as soon as you hear the tone, you're like, oh shit. It all sounds like he's like on a on a mountaintop with no shirt on, and it's raining, and he's fucking playing these riffs to the gods. He's got that kind of like epic thing, has always been there. Sure.
It's almost like an inverse George Lynch hair metal thing that you would see. You know, I think Lynch is playing on top of a volcano in one of the videos, but it's like a totally different thing because it's, you know, bathed in Sabbath and just a totally different style, you know?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's, you know, talking about the singularity of sleep. I think what's so interesting is, you know, I mean, the last 3 decades long ode to sort of Sabbath doom has been filled with a lot of, you know, lifeless clones, and Sleep managed to sort of avoid that and inspire other clones that were good too. I mean, I think that Sleep had a significant impact on Electric Wizard. I have to imagine that Just was really paying attention to what they were doing. I mean, Just was into his own stuff too. I don't want to say that they were a clone, but
I think they kind of have the same DNA. They have the same DNA. Like they come from the same spot.
And again, you know, Just was in bands around this time that were, you know, predated Wizard, but I'm sure he heard what Sleep was doing, and it maybe gave him the confidence to sort of go full in on the sort of feedback laden Sabbath kind of worship type stuff, you know?
Yeah. Cause really, I think the first Wizard record sounds more like Holy Mountain. Than anything. Absolutely. And then I think after that, that's when they really kind of like blew up and started sounding they were like,
kind of went on their own trajectory.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the other thing about Dragonaut too, and this was like a connective tissue in, you know, between the I Hate God episode that we did last and then going back to early spring, you know, this was the opening song in the Gummo soundtrack and in the Gummo movie.
Yeah.
You know, so it's kind of this like platonic psych stoner doom perfection, you know, that you sort of reach, and it's like reaching into the subculture of the, you know, indie movies, and it's on Earache Records, but yet it doesn't really belong on Earache Records in a weird way. And so it has this cult sort of aspect to it where they're, you know, they just, I don't know, they got their attention in weird ways. And I think that's really cool, you know?
Yeah, I think they fit kind of at that time with the whole Earache roster where they had a more interesting, like eclectic group of bands playing, you know, like Confessor, and then you'd have death metal and grindcore and Lawnmower Death, all this kind of shit in the same label, Fudge Tunnel.
Yeah. No, you're right. It kind of fits in. It almost fits because it doesn't fit, you know?
Yeah.
In the same way that Relapse used to have kind of like a weird sort of lineup in like the late 90s that was sort of like that, you know, with like High on Fire and Mastodon, and then all this like weird grind, and then you had Amorphous, and you know what I mean? It was like
very curated to their tastes.
Exactly. But yeah, basically, I mean, you get stuff that's going on in that song, the breakdown at like the 3-minute mark with this like kind of cool, playful, like jazz swinging rhythm section. That's going to be kind of a big kind of foundational part of Sleep, you know, mammoth grooves, you know, all that stuff. I mean, the whole thing sort of like breaks apart in some ways, and then it restructures back together with one like, you know, short Al verse before Pike just goes into this like monumental solo, which is kind of improvised too. And he'll speak to that in this episode a little bit. And then you've got this like killer, like Al bass solo that kind of takes the whole song kind of out in a odd way, you know, that you didn't hear a lot of songs doing in 1992, you know? So
yeah, I think the whole power trio dynamic works really well for them.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about the differences in almost cutting the fat between Volume 1 and Holy Mountain with you know, becoming more efficient and focused by getting rid of that second guitar player when we sort of get into all that. But yeah, so I mean, like I said, that's kind of a perfect opening salvo for people that maybe aren't familiar with Sleep to sort of, you know, see all the elements that you're going to hear in various ways throughout this whole episode, really, because they improve upon it, and they may go like more in certain directions, but they're always Sleep, you know? So but yeah, so since Mark and I have recorded I Hate God, we went to Kiss on Friday. So that was quite an event, a lot of fun.
Still coming down from that, man.
Yeah, no, it was unexpectedly. I mean, not unexpectedly, but there were some surprises there that were very fun. We had lawn seats at DTE, and it had been raining a bunch. And if you've never been to, non-Michigan people might not know, but DTE on the hill can get quite muddy. And so it kind of turned into a mudslide. So we couldn't really go and watch from the center of the lawn to have like a good sort of sight. And so, Detroit Rock City kicked off, and I was sort of struggling to see what was going on and kind of like annoyed. So I kind of panicked with another one of our friends that was there, and I was like, all right, I'm going to try and see if I can find like a different position. And Mark, taller than me, kind of held strong. I was like, oh, okay, I'll stay here for a moment. And then a couple other guys we were with wandered off I think they got beer. And then they texted me and they're like, hey, we're in like row DD in the, and I'm like, oh crap. I've never done that before. I've never sort of tried to like sneak past to sort of get down there. Cause I'm a little bit chicken shit when it comes to authority sometimes.
Well, plus it's tough to see a goddamn thing in there.
Exactly. So I was like, you know what? Fuck it. Like, I can't stand on the hill. Like, let's just try it. And then we made it down there, and Mark joined us, soon after. And so we had these now all of a sudden amazing seats that were way closer and covered. We weren't dealing with the rain anymore.
We're probably halfway down into the pavilion.
Yeah, it was incredible. And then I remember this point, and I don't know if you were kind of at the other end, but I remember like right near the edge, because we were near the edge of kind of the walking aisle, all of a sudden all these like police and security started coming in. And I kind of got like that weird panic. I was like, oh, maybe they know that a bunch of people have been like pouring in. And I just didn't know what was happening. And they kind of surrounded us in a weird way. And then all of a sudden during Love Gun, or right before Love Gun happened, all of a sudden, you see Paul, commandoing towards us, G.I. Joe style.
Fucking skyhook.
Yeah. And all of a sudden
we 15 feet away from us.
Yeah, we were right next to this alternate stage for Paul to sing Love Gun, and I Was Just Made for Loving You. And it's great. Yeah. So it's that
was the highlight of the thing.
Incredible. And we definitely got some hip thrusts our direction. Paul was sending his sex god, status towards us. So
the guy that was behind us, I don't know if you noticed or not, but he was like FaceTiming with his son. He's like, "That's my man. That's my man. Watch this."
That's so funny. Oh God, it was cool, man. It was fun.
And they sounded great.
Yeah,
for dudes like Paul's 69, Gene's 72.
72. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, if your grandpas can get up there and do what they did, then good for them, man. Because I don't think any of my relatives that age could do anything close to that.
No, and that skyhook thing, he was just hanging on to it. He wasn't clipped in or anything.
Yeah.
And holding his guitar, and you could see his breath when he landed on that thing too. It was pretty fucking cold.
Yeah, it was. I mean, Gene was rising up in the platform. I mean, they pulled out all their old tricks, but not in a bad way. It was the fire, the blood, they played Beth. Hell, they played Black Diamond and a little piece of 100,000 Years. So for those of you that heard our Kiss episode that we recorded 2 summers ago, it was. A lot of those songs were there, maybe not all the deep cut Ace stuff that we would have liked, but it
was a good selection though. And the way they actually use like the modern, the screens, they didn't use them just as like projections of what they're playing, but they like fucked with them. So like when Gene was doing his bass solo, his head was like, the size of a bus behind him.
Yeah.
With all this like weird gel lights and shit. And it was
the really red lights and things. Yeah. It was cool. I mean, I didn't know what to expect. And I think the best litmus test for the whole thing was, we had a couple of guys I teach with that ended up backing out. So we had, extra tickets available. And I texted a friend of mine named Luke, who's not a big metalhead and really not a big classic rock guy. And he, was like, well, I'm in for the experience because I've heard, Kiss is an experience, but he only knew like 3 or 4 of their songs. And at the end, he was just like, man, I was like almost like emotionally moved when those guys said goodbye, He felt it. He was like, and I think that speaks to like, people in the 70s who actually went to their shows and saw them live, like how it can convert people, whereas maybe just seeing their albums didn't necessarily convert people, but that live experience was so personal and so visceral and so entertaining. And it was, I was pumped. I'd never seen Kiss before. I believe you haven't seen them, correct?
Not that I remember.
Yeah.
I was told I did when I was very young, but
Exactly. Yeah. And I've told the story on the Kiss episode where my mom and dad were on their way to see Kiss, and my dad got sick from drinking too much. And so they never actually made it to see them. I don't think I was, in utero at that point, but who knows?
Just a sparkle in the eye at that point.
I might have had a chance to maybe have heard Kiss in the womb, but I'm not 100% sure on that timeline.
Maybe you're conceived to Love Gun.
Yeah, maybe it happened, oh God. So, so it was great. It was great. And then last night, I don't think I told you this, but another Mark, one of my friends I teach with, who has been in a couple episodes as testimonials. He plays in a punk rock band, the Red Shift, in the St. Thomas Boys Academy in the Detroit area. But he had asked me to go to a show with him because there was a band, and I have to look up their name right now. And it wasn't because of the headliner. In fact, the headliner, he was like, I'm not super excited about him, but he's, what are they called? Turnstile. And they're sort of like a throwback kind of 90s punk hardcore band that has a little bit of like Beastie Boys, Rage Against the Machine, some of that vibe to it a little bit, not necessarily the politics, but like that kind of some funk bass and definitely some 90s overtones or whatever. And he's been kind of into them. And I guess they're on Roadrunner. So Roadrunner signed them recently. Huh. But they were opening for this really fucking bizarre set. And they were at the Masonic last night. And the band they were opening for is this like weird hip hop band that like young people love. Like some of my students are into them, called Suicide Boys. And it was the weirdest fucking crowd, dude. Like I need to talk to my students about what I experienced and what I saw there, because it was like, I think it was vape culture is what I was seeing, but I'm not 100% sure. Cause like I see kids until they graduate, and then a lot of them I don't see ever again. And it feels like what I was seeing is like a lot of the kids who were like 18 and beyond, who had made a lot of bad choices in their life, and they were all at that concert. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it. And it was a very diverse crowd. It was very young. A lot of like face tattoos and, like I said, kind of vape culture-y type stuff. But again, at one point we were like, is this a sociological experiment? Because we had to stand in line for we were in line for an hour and a half to get into the Masonic, because they were checking Vax cards and they did not prepare themselves. And it was like sold out.
They had like two people working the doors.
Oh my God. It was like forever. We got in line at 8:30 and got into the venue at 10. And he only got to see like 12 minutes of Turnstile before Suicide Boys came on. So I felt bad for Mark. He bought my ticket, so I didn't have to pay any money. He's like, I just need somebody to go with, because I don't want to go to this show alone. Because he goes, I know it's this really weird atmosphere, and I need like someone who's a little bit more open-minded than some of my other friends were. And I was like, sure, whatever. I'm game, as long as we don't have to stay for the headliner. And he didn't really want to stay, but we did stay for a few like Suicide Boys songs. And dude, I tell you, like, I'll send you the video later. It's fucking strange. Like, I don't know if they're like a new, almost like kind of how ICP had their own like weird subculture.
Yeah.
It almost feels like that's sort of what they are, but I'm probably wrong, because it felt like you and I getting dropped off at like a manga convention. Like, you understand it a little bit because you're a fan of comics and art, but like there's also something you're totally not getting. You know what I mean?
It's like seeing furries at a convention.
Yeah. And so it was interesting to be there, because we were definitely fish out of water. I told him, I said, this is probably what it would be like to be like a mod from the 60s who was into like the British invasion stuff, who like wandered into CBGBs for like an agnostic front show. Like, you kind of were a fan of the music that inspired punk, but then like this like different version of it with like tough guys and like shirtless people, like you kind of would be like, whoa, what is happening right now? And you probably have just a very strange experience. But at one point on stage, and this is the part that was sort of fascinating, they like start screaming at this like group of people to like open up a pit. And so like they're very concerned with like pits and mosh pits and circle pits, but yet it's like hip hop. And I don't get it. And I guess I was looking up Suicide Boys on Spotify, and like some of their songs have like 300 million like downloads. So I'm like, okay, this is like a thing that's clearly big, but I don't get.
Yeah, and it's not on your radar in any capacity.
Oh my God, not at all. But they're from New Orleans, and they're like a duo. And I guess they've sort of dabbled in punk rock. Like they're influenced by Misfits and Minor Threat and Leftover Crack and stuff. And they kind of play in like that. What is it? The horrorcore genre, that like Gravediggers and some of that stuff. So it's weird. Yeah, Isham and things like that. But it was interesting. So we stayed for a few songs because I'm like, we're here. Let's just soak this in. And like, this is like a cultural experience. We could kind of like reflect on it later. But it was quite a dichotomy to Kiss, where I very much felt at home and comfortable and stuff. So, but yeah. And then one last thing before we sort of dive in is I forgot to read this at the end of the I Hate God episode, but I figured before we dive full scale ahead into sleep, I got a letter in August from a fan of ours, Dylan, I think, DYL is how he signed it. And he puts together a cool fanzine called DAMB, a doomed rock fanzine. And he does reviews of like older stuff from like the late 80s and early 90s and stuff. And just writes about what's happening kind of in like the doom world. Like I think a lot of this letter is about the Al Morris, the guy who was the founder of Iron Man, that Pittsburgh band, Maryland band. And I think it's right after he passed away. And so it's almost like a memorial to him and kind of talking about the whole like life of him and the impact that Iron Man had and stuff, which is cool. You know, like that's a fun little idea. But he wrote us a letter. I just thought I'd read it because it's kind of fun. He says, I won't bore you with too many particulars, but I've pretty much been a Requiem fan since the beginning. I worked at a film archive in college in Utah that had a wealth of props, promos, and photos from Western films. My job was to catalog those items, and I'd listen to Requiem episodes pretty much as they dropped in real time from about 2008. He says there were barely any podcasts then. Thank you for the wealth of knowledge and entertainment the show has brought me. Sorry, it's been awesome to see the show grow and see more people in the fold. He said Joseph Schaefer edited a few of my articles in Invisible Oranges. So Joe apparently might know this guy as well.
Oh, nice.
He says, anyways, I'm a big fan of yours and Mark's work. I'm a cartoonist myself, and I look to Mark as a big inspiration. I've included a few. Yeah, there you go. I've included a few copies of a newsletter I'm doing called DAMB. This issue is obviously very short, but features a little write-up on one of my favorite obscure mid-Atlantic doom gems, Iron Man. I'm working on another issue right now, which will feature more pages, a comic by me, and all about trouble, which is pretty cool. Nice. So he actually wrote this before Eric passed away. So I'm sure we'll
have to figure out how to get copies of those.
Maybe I think he'll mail them to us. Yeah, exactly. But he says it's his all-time favorite band, Trouble. Love the Doom episodes, and I'm grateful for your research and effort in making the show. I'll send you a copy of my next scene. There you go. When it's done, feel free to give one to Mark. I have one for you. Just haven't given it to you. And anyone else who maybe dig. He says, peace, love, and doom. So pretty cool. So
thanks, man. That was great.
It'll be kind of a fun one. So yeah, I'll give you a copy of that. He also mailed me some like old sports cards. So I got a WCW card from 1991 of one of the shittiest wrestlers who's ever lived, named El Gigante.
Never heard of him.
So what you got to do, Mark, is later Google El Gigante, and you got to see this guy was 7'7". All right. And he fought Undertaker at one of the early WrestleManias, and he would wear a suit with fake muscles on it and like body fur. I shit you not. It was like one of the worst fucking decisions they ever made. It's so ridiculous. Wow. And he couldn't move. He was 7'7", and he kind of just like, I mean, he made like Andre the Giant look agile. So it was very,
Jesus.
Yeah. So he was in I think WWE, he was like the Giant Gonzalez. And then in WCW, he was El Gigante. So, yeah. So thank you for that card.
Like 6'5" or 7 something?
6'7", 6'8". He was pretty tall. So yeah. But of course, El Gigante towered over him by like a foot. But the thing is, he couldn't fucking move, so no one cared. So,
he just run around him and
just really bad matches, So, but anyway, so I appreciate that card because I think it's kind of like with a little wink because he probably knew we were a wrestling fan. So now we kind of get into the backstory on these folks, a little bit on sleep, and so let's do it. Let's kind of hit the ground running. Obviously, they're going to start as Asbestosdeath, and what you're going to hear throughout the episode is before Kiss, we managed to get a hold of Matt and do a very short interview. It was about 25 minutes, but very succinct. So Matt he knew what was going on, and he kind of stuck to the narrative. And so you'll hear sprinklings of that throughout the episode. And he does talk a little bit about the early origins of the band. And he makes mention of the fact that he actually was born and grew up for a bit in Southfield, which is pretty close to where Mark lives, and not too far away from me. Yeah. And so he kind of knew Michigan. So he was kind of like, oh, cool. And we were kind of talking about that. He actually used to vacation up in a spot that a lot of families in Armada vacation up in the Thumb on Lake Huron there. So it's just like a kind of a small world sort of thing.
Yeah.
But he talks about, let's see, I've got this thing I found in a Decibel issue where he's kind of talking a little bit about his childhood. And he just said, after Michigan, he was hauled off to Oakland for a new home state in Oregon. And it says back in his youth, Hewlett-Packard landed his parents in Denver. So he's kind of moving around a lot as a youth. But when they split up, Pike was thrust back into the void. He said, my mom and I were poor, so I did things as a kid to make money, like stealing stereos, stealing cars. That caught up with me. Military school in Kansas gave way to Silicon Valley. And he says, quote, when I got sent to my dad's, I went back to school because I dropped out and found the first kid who would have me in a band, which was Asbestosdeath. It turned into Sleep from there and then High on Fire. He says it was a rough moment in my childhood where a lot of shit happened. So it's a little bit on Matt's backstory because he does make mention in the interview of military school, but he didn't really give me the sort of full story.
Yeah.
So essentially these guys start as Asbestosdeath, and it was formed in San Jose in the late 80s by Al Cisneros on bass and vocals. Chris Hakius, I think is probably how you pronounce that, Hakius, on drums. Tom Choi was on guitar, and then Pike is going to join later, as he just alluded to there. And they're very DIY. They were kind of inspired by the whole kind of Bay Area hardcore noise kind of scene that was going on.
Totally.
Probably, you hear a lot of Neurosis in there. Mm-hmm. You hear, especially early Neurosis, the stuff we played at the beginning of the Through Silver episode, when they were definitely coming more out of the hardcore kind of scene. Also a lot of sludge. I think that was probably their biggest influence, was probably stuff like what the Melvins were doing, or certainly Black Flag, the Side B and things like that.
Yeah.
And they released 2 EPs. That was about it. They did Unclean, which I think was the first EP they released, and that was kind of released by themselves, that DIY kind of thing. And then they put out Dejection on Profane Existence, which I don't know much about that label, but I'm sure it was just kind of a small little label. Then basically a tiff kind of happened, I think, between Tom and Al. And Tom decided to leave. He'll later form a band called Operator Generator, which I don't know much about them. And then that's when they decided to sort of change their name to Sleep and add a second guitar player named Justin Marler. And that's when they produce a demo, which I think gets them signed. And some of the stuff on that demo actually ends up both on Volume 1, and also one of the things that was on the demo was the Druid, which will also end up on Holy Mountain. Mm-hmm. But the first song they actually wrote together as Sleep was a Black Sabbath cover, apropos, and that was Lord of This World. And so you can find that on that demo. Is that the song that they do for the Master of Misery comp for Sabbath that Earache put out?
I think so. There's 2 different versions of that. There's the Toy Factory version and the Earache version. And I always forget what's what.
Yeah, I forgot to look and see because I have it somewhere upstairs. But I
got it, but I can't. I don't think I can reach it from where I'm at.
Don't worry about it. We can look later. But my assumption is it was Lord of This World that they did there. So pretty cool. And then that's, basically the demo starts to craft them into their debut album a year later, which is Volume 1. And Volume 1 was produced by Billy Anderson. So I don't know the backstory on Billy Anderson, like his career in terms of how early he was doing production. I got to imagine this is one of the early records that he probably did. I know he hails from the San Francisco Bay Area. So
yeah, I'm sure he was probably in bands and stuff at the time.
Yeah, I got to look back. I can't remember if he did. Was Through Silver the first Neurosis
I
thing
think so.
Did? Okay, I couldn't remember if he had done earlier Neurosis albums with them or not. Yeah, it's been a while since we did that Neurosis episode. So I've kind of forgotten, unfortunately. But yeah, basically what you're going to hear on Volume 1 is, kind of continues some of the more nihilistic kind of sludge that you heard with Asbestosdeath. It's a lot darker and angrier than most of the later Sleep stuff. But there is some kind of like moments within some of the songs where you hear like a little bit of what I call that hazy kind of sloppiness. which is a lot warmer and brighter and kind of more in the stoner vein, I guess. It had a Salvador Dali cover, which is pretty cool. It
looks super unique. Yeah, the whole layout, the color scheme, it was like nothing else that was out at that time.
Yeah. And I think I'm trying to remember who put that out. That might have been Profane Existence as well. I forgot to write that down. But yeah, so it's, it didn't get a lot of coverage. I mean, I doubt, did you guys know about this before Holy Mountain? Like, was it in your guys' Requiem circles,
No, after Holy Mountain came out, that was huge. And then I went back and discovered there was that first record. I found it at Wide Rip Records in Flint.
Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah. And basically, I mean, for the most part, Volume 1, like 3/4 of the songs that Asbestosdeath wrote were re-recorded here. So it's almost like, Asbestosdeath, 1.0, and it's kind of like a prequel to the real Sleep. So it's almost like this holding pattern in between the two kind of versions that you'll sort of hear throughout the episode. So, I mean, a lot of it has kind of that noisy, industrialized kind of crust punk thing that you associate more, like I said, with early Neurosis or even Godflesh at times. You can kind of hear it in there.
For sure.
I mean, in terms too of like what got these guys kind of into Doom, I found that in that Terrorizer Secret History of Doom series, they actually do an interview with Matt Pike. And the first couple questions, it's Jay Bennett, who we'll hear a lot from Jay Bennett throughout this episode, because he also inducted Jerusalem into the Decibel Hall of Fame. So there's a lot of different things that we'll refer to throughout that. But they basically asked how Matt got into Doom, and he said, the same way I got into metal in general, I started playing it. I just seemed to come natural. Beyond that, I got into Sabbath, St. Vitus, Celtic Frost, Melvins. I just started getting into everything that was dark and slow. Doom is a dirge, it's a funeral mass, but I don't want to be categorized as Doom or stoner rock or anything else. Every rhythm section I've played with is just guys trying to get their feelings out through loud distortion, so they don't end up as serial killers. So I thought that was
Gary Holt, man.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was a good sort of way. And then just kind of weighing in, because it's going to be the sort of elephant in the room throughout a lot of the episode. They sort of ask him on the importance of Black Sabbath. Says every band I've ever been in has been worshipers of Iommi, Butler, Ward, Ozzy, and Dio. If you're into metal and you want to learn how to play, learn Black Sabbath first. Those guys did something tremendous to this earth. The music they put out when they were on fire, they were just walking atop people's heads. No one had riffs like Iommi. He should have his own Knights Templar. Although actually, I guess that's what High on Fire is. And the Iomic Temple will never fall. So pretty cool. So yeah, so that's kind of what the early influences that sort of get these guys kind of into it. And so I guess for better lack of terms, let's kind of get into the early stuff here and kind of get it out of the way, so we can kind of really get into the stuff that I think people are here for, which is probably Holy Mountain and Jerusalem / Dopesmoker, which we have a lot to say about that. So, so basically the song you're going to hear from Asbestosdeath is a tune called Nail. And I just wrote, it's got kind of a haunting Neurosis-esque, ISIS-esque kind of anticipatory atmospheric kind of beginning that sort of gives way into like a crushing evil riff. And that riff, I was really trying to sort of like figure out what the riff kind of reminded me of. And I kind of just said it reminded me of like Sabbath, Slayer, and Celtic Frost, like in a blender. It was almost too heavy for Sabbath. It wasn't fast enough for Slayer, but it's had this like dark energy about it. It's a cool riff.
It's almost like picking all the notes in between those three and making something out of it.
Yeah. Remind me of like something you hear like later with like Kylesa or something like that. Kylesa seemed to almost walk that line sometimes. You got some sludgy bass breakdowns, and kind of Al, you hear his accustomed noodling that he will sort of obviously use throughout his whole career. He's very active on the bass, even though it's kind of buried in the production here, because this is sort of like demo like quality. It's got this, odd glacial sort of sludge to it. But also one thing I really noticed, and I even noticed it in Volume 1, is there's a ton of like math rock kind of stuff going on.
Oh yeah, there's like Slint tendencies and stuff in it.
Yeah, Slint and probably like Big Black and some of those kind of things happening, which, you hear that stuff, I guess, in early Neurosis too, right? Where they kind of make these really oddball choices.
Pain of Mind, there's a lot of like real stop-start weird riffs and There's lots of ideas.
Yep. And so you'll hear that right in the middle, and it's a pretty interesting surprise before you kind of go right back into kind of that doom sludge kind of part. It's even some pinch harmonics that sort of make their appearance. And
I'm not sure. Kind of a surprising thing for that era.
I don't know if that was Matt. That might have been Tom, the other guitar player too. You know, it seems like maybe that was maybe something he brought to the table. Perhaps
there seems like there's like two different people, two different riffs that are trying to like fight for dominance in this song too.
Yeah. And I wonder if Tom is the guy that had a lot more of the math rock aspect in it. I didn't get a chance to ask.
Maybe I'm sure the harmonics are. That's got to be Pike.
Yeah, absolutely. You can hear, like I said, that kind of San Francisco kind of crust DIY punk kind of spirit in the DNA, as well as like, you know, the math indie rock kind of haunting section in the final minute. I said it's pretty dark and moody. It's for you know, for a band that's more associated with kind of like fun and, you know, kind of kicking back and losing yourself in a song. You know, like this, it's very edgy. You know, which is obviously
it's like a Meebix.
Yeah, exactly. It's got more of that, or rudimentary Peni, and there's some of those kind of things happening.
Like a really atmospheric punk stuff.
Yeah. The funniest part is the last 10 seconds of the song might be the surest preview of sleep in the entire song. It's
that
just
hook at the end.
Yeah, that very, very hook. It's almost like, oh, all right, there's something. There's a nugget that's going to sort of hint towards the future. You know.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of DNA sprinkled along the trail that you can follow.
Yeah, yep. And you'll hear it in Volume 1 as well. We're going to hear a trio of tunes from Volume 1 from their debut record when they actually become Sleep. The first tune, Suffering, still has like that anarcho-punk spirit, especially in the lyrics. It's kind of it's a screed against kind of Western capitalism's pursuit of greed and profit and the destruction of human life. So that's very much something we would associate more with the Ian Glasper episode we did, you know, on
for sure.
Anarcho stuff. But from, you know, so lyric standpoint, it's definitely still has a foot more in what Asbestosdeath was probably up to. But the sound is definitely here more kind of Sabbathian in nature, especially with the slower kind of doom sections breaking up kind of the sludgy punk parts, you know?
Well, there's like, you know, absolutely like just like a Metallica chug and then a Forced of Equilibrium riff. There is still a lot of ideas on this record that aren't really focused like they will be in the next one, but...
Yep, absolutely. I just said there's an interesting section buried in the mix around like 3:45 that to me, like it gives way to this kind of the last kind of couple minutes of the song, kind of this headbanging style of doom that to me seems like more of a preview of where Sleep is going to go next. You know, like, okay, we don't have to do a lot of complicated like math rock kind of things. We could actually just like let a riff breathe and just kind of let it do its thing, you know?
I think this is where the repetition becomes more and more evident in the songwriting, where they'll just like kind of like, it's almost like a blues thing where you just like chunk on this one riff forever and let the drums kind of do its thing, its bass do its thing. And it's like a raga or something.
Yeah. It's like they haven't figured out how to simplify the songs enough yet, but there's moments where they do. And that's where you're like, okay, this is the formula. They're still like trapped between kind of two different kind of styles. You know, I mean, I think the Wall of Yawn, the next tune, I said the song sounds fairly similar to a lot of what's going on throughout the rest of the album in terms of its kind of schizophrenic nature. It's got hardcore blast mixing with Sabbath grooves. You know, Al's vocals are still, for me, a little too shouted. They're still a little bit more hardcore than probably what they become.
I agree.
But there's these kind of cool parts in it where there's like a quiet talking passage that to me is like more forward thinking to what Al's going to do later, where he's almost like chanting through the vocals a little bit more rather than like trying to actually sing or shout or scream or anything like that. And it's, you know, it's that moment where like the lyrics, even in the song to Wall of Yawn, they kind of like feign a lot of that dark nihilism that, you know, Asbestosdeath and even the Suffering we're kind of going into. And they kind of start to sing more about what I would call like druggy, cosmic, meditative, sort of esoteric things.
Hawkwind.
yeah, it's definitely a lot of Hawkwind sort of stuff. I mean, the lyrics in Walls of Yawn, you know, there's a section that says, souls of friction, close your eyes, will guide you to the other side, atmosphere inviting you, your spirit trapped in solitude, altered celestial, time cosmic, wisdom flowing spirit. You know, and the song right before we hear, it was this like anti-capitalism sort of like rant, you know? So like,
there,
it's like volume 1 is almost interesting as a science experiment for you to pull apart the different parts that, when you stitch them back together are going to make up Holy Mountain for sure, Well,
there's even, I don't know if you noticed in Wall of Yawn or not, but there's this weird tendency for them to kind of like fuck with the tempo in a really, really subtle way where it almost kind of like oscillates at a point.
And oscillation is a huge part of the sleep formula.
Yeah.
And, talking to Pike and hearing like what a big fan he is of like improv jazz and Coltrane and Miles and stuff like that, it starts to lock in because, one of the things with even pre-Bitches Brew, Miles was this sort of modal jazz where you're sort of playing in these sort of circular patterns and stuff. And it wasn't straight like improv, like free jazz necessarily, but it definitely is like the pathway between like bebop and like free jazz almost. Miles was sort of playing in that middle zone. And I feel like Sleep does that where, you could hear like some Miles like jazz records and it seems like it's just really repetitive, but there's like subtle changes that they're doing. And it's like that oscillating thing. And, Mike's probably a better person, our old manager, to explain this than you and I can. But I think like, if you sort of think about it from the standpoint of what Sleep's going to do later, it kind of makes sense a little bit,
Yeah. You're not coming. It's not like a pop sensibility by any stretch of the imagination. It's like anti-pop, really. So it's not like you're listening to the song to like dance to it. It's like it's a physical experience.
Yep. Yeah.
Like you're supposed to, this is supposed to like, it's like a, meditative chant or something.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if you think about it like a song, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah. There's not going to be a traditional chorus, verse, or any of that kind of stuff really happening. And I'm not saying that there aren't songs that have some of that, but usually they just kind of like, they lose malleability and they just kind of become formless most of the time, and that's kind of what Sleep's almost kind of known for. One last thing on Wall of Yawn is that solo at the end feels very improvisational. It feels more like what you'll hear on Holy Mountain and Dopesmoker and stuff in terms of what Pike's doing there.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's like kind of a real, the Sleep of the future for sure. And then I thought it would be interesting to play Scourge, which is an instrumental tune, because I think this is really the song for me on volume 1 where you can almost hear Sleep working out these ideas the most, they're almost getting the old style out of their system here. And at the same time, they're trying out, like I said, a series of new ideas that the band's going to explore a lot further, certainly on the next 2 releases. You really start to hear Chris's like cymbal riding, kind of looseness to his drumming. And that's obviously the defining feature of Chris, is this sort of Bill Ward kind of jazzy, loose kind of cymbal ride style that, other drummers have done beyond Sabbath, but that's probably the easiest, more about drumming than I do. Are there other drummers besides Bill Ward that you kind of heard before Sleep that did that pretty well? Or
like Ginger Baker used to do that shit too, but just not consistently.
That's true. And he has more of a formal jazz training too, so that would make sense that like that sort of jazz cymbal ride kind of style.
Yeah, I think like where you're leading with the cymbals instead of, that's kind of the propulsion, and the snare is more just kind of like a intermittent, directional thing for you to figure out. But like everything's going through, like the cymbals are what's driving the forward momentum of the song usually.
Sure. Yeah, and you even hear like Al be a little bit more playful on bass. There's kind of a bass break in the song at one point. And even
this
like
is the John Christ School of Guitar pinch harmonics shit too. It's like a dancing song.
Yeah. Do you think that's Pike, or do you think that's the other guy?
I feel like that's Pike, because he would go on to. It feels like something. Especially these last 3 records are very like heavy metal and epic.
Yeah, of High on Fire, you mean?
Yeah.
I think you're right. Now that you say that, I'd be kind of curious. I didn't get a chance to ask him, like, who had what parts on stuff. But yeah, you probably.
It feels like
there.
Matt's always the feel guy, and the pinch harmonic feels more like a feel than whatever the other guy's doing. It feels kind of like it would go more in Matt's kind of like toolbox.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for people that pay real close attention to this, because we're you'll hear it at sort of the end, in right about the minute 15 mark of Scourge. Listen closely. It's the intro of Dragonaut. It's the same type of riff pattern and stuff there. And so it's like this whole thing feels like a petri dish for like the future of sleep. You know, they're just like testing different like methods out and seeing, you know, it's more heavy metal. It's a little bit more melodic. It's a little bit more open. And it's a great way to close volume 1 because it's almost, like I said, the linking thing, you know, between like, it's almost like the suffering is at the beginning of the record. And that's the most in the Asbestosdeath camp. And then as the record sort of like proceeds forward, they're like getting all the Asbestosdeath stuff out of their system and almost arriving finally at sleep at the very, very end. It's
yeah, it is a very weird linear record.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
and I don't know
from going from their previous stuff to their next, like the bridge is just very straight and consistent. It's not often you see that in a band. Well, especially the sequencing of the songs even work.
Yeah. And I got to go back and check real quick because I forget which songs were actually on Asbestosdeath's kind of demos and things like that. I think, yeah. So the Suffering and Scourge, even the instrumental, originally started off as Asbestosdeath, as did the song Anguish. So it's kind of interesting that those are like the ones, you know, most rooted, yet for some reason they changed Scourge around from what it was on the demos back with Asbestosdeath, and they kind of add some kind of newer, more fresher elements to it. So the song itself is almost literally a linkage, not just the whole album, you know, but just this like instrumental song to kind of end things. So let's get into it. Let's hear, you know, the sort of original formation of these folks, and then we'll talk more about the stuff that you're really here for, which is probably Holy Mountain and Dopesmoker. So we've got Nail from Asbestosdeath's Dejection demo from 1990. Then a year later from Volume 1, we've got The Suffering, The Wall of Yawn, and Scourge.
I think us, like when I joined Asbestosdeath, they were heavily influenced by like Neurosis and the Melvins and like Subvert and like a bunch of these like kind of, it was like doom punk, you know what I mean? Like at the time, like Neurosis didn't even sound like Neurosis at that point. They sounded like, you know, early Neurosis or Christ on Parade, or so we were in this scene that, you know what I mean? It embraced doom and it embraced like those sounds that were coming out of the Bay then. When I moved there from, well, actually I'd gotten out of military school. I got in trouble as a kid. And I like moved there and I met Al and he's like, well, why don't you come to practice and watch us play? And I just showed up with my guitar and amp and already learned all the songs and like forced my way into the band. I was all pushy about it. And yeah, from there, you know, we had Asbestosdeath for quite a couple years more, 3 years more or something like that. And Al and Tom Choi, the guitar player, kind of had a disagreement or a falling out. And I was living with Tom and I had to kind of pull the trigger on what, you know, which way that was going to go. And from there, me and Al had been doing a lot of acid and doing bong hits. And one day he's all, dude, why don't we call the band Sleep? I was all, fuck. And, you know, you're all high and stoned and shit. And we're all, fuck, Sleep. All right. Then we got another guitar player, Justin. Justin went with us for one album, and we started like doing a little more driving up and down the West Coast. We never really toured. Like we're young. I mean, we were all like, I met Al when I was like 17, and Al was about my age. He's a little younger. And so we didn't get to go on a whole lot of touring yet. We couldn't even, you know, we barely could afford our instruments. And then we got Justin, and we ended up, you know, getting a little van and doing a little West Coast. And then Justin went and became a monk on Kodiak Island and, you know, just kind of gave up his life for a while.
You heard the Scourge, the Wall of Yawn, and the Suffering from Sleep's Volume 1. And then we kicked everything off with a demo from Asbestosdeath, a song called Nail. And so I have something to read as we sort of go into this next section. And this comes from an issue of Decibel that Mark did the cover for, the Doom Metal Top 100 Albums of All Time.
Yes.
And Sleep's Holy Mountain came in at number 42. And Matt Solis, this is what he had to say about it. And I think it's a appropriate way for us to begin a discussion on this record. It says, "Come one, come all, and witness the glorious birth of stoner doom. Did you notice a viscous cloud of green smoke seeping out of your speakers the first time you heard that sleazy opening riff in Dragonaut? It's cool. You weren't going crazy. This record might as well have been pressed out of pure THC. It's insane to think that Holy Mountain in all its stonery, fuzzy glory was released into a mainstream metal scene that had Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power and White Zombie's La Sexorcisto as its main reference points. This record is the antithesis of industrialized production and hit parader marketing. It's the baked cousin who won't stop talking to you about Sir Lord Baltimore. And it spawned an entire generation of Sabbath-worshipping weed heads who are still proselytizing through their Marshall stacks today. Every song on Holy Mountain is an absolute banger. The Druid, Aquarian, From Beyond, the title track. No matter where you turn, you're assaulted by Matt Pike's enormous riffs, plural, Al Cisneros's psychedelic bass, Chris Haikuis's monolithic drumming, and Billy Anderson's filthy production. It all came together on this bad boy 2 decades later, and I still have cotton mouth." So there we are, Holy Mountain. Tell me about you and Chris kind of stumbling on this record, because certainly I didn't know about it till, you know, I think the first Sleep song I heard was on Masters of Misery, and we just confirmed that it wasn't the Lord of This World song that was on it. On my version, at least, it was Snowblind. So
yeah, honestly, don't remember. I don't remember.
You guys were buying earache stuff, or at least getting service, probably.
Well, I think we got service this. I don't remember Chris really caring about it as much. Mm-hmm. Like I was just, I was 100% Cathedral and all that kind of like vibe at the time. So,
is that where you put this? Is like kind of like, okay, this is part of this Cathedral thing. That's kind of this new thing starting.
Probably. I mean, just I had those tendencies to hear more stuff like that. I don't think I had a conscious thought of, this and Cathedral go together, but it just seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed it wasn't like oppressive death metal or black metal. It was just that other kind of like outside. And, we're listening to Pentagram and stuff at this time too. That had a little bit of a resurgence. Okay.
Yeah. When did that Pentagram come out on Peaceful? Was that 92, 93?
Before Warned?
Yeah. It had to be around this time.
Yeah. 93, maybe?
93. Yeah. Okay. Had you heard Pentagram before Warned?
I don't believe so. Or I don't remember.
So really it was like Cathedral, Sleep Holy Mountain, this. I mean, you had Monster Magnet thrown in there, maybe Caius, so you had some other bands you probably were familiar with that were kind of doing similar-y things, maybe.
I didn't know shit about Caius until years later. But,
okay. So I didn't know
Monster Magnet was in the air.
Gotcha. I mean, I think that's really interesting for people trying to like establish like context for what 1992 felt like, I mean, it's recorded by Billy Anderson at Razor's Edge in San Francisco, which is going to be one of their go-to sort of spots, which gets them signed to this kind of shitty earache contract that Pike will, refer to a little bit.
They were all shitty.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think anybody had a good earache contract.
No.
And I just said it's a weird time in American Doom because bands like Monster Magnet, COC, Caius, Clutch, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, like they all obviously bathed in Sabbath in some capacity, but they were more marketed and associated with like alternative or grunge. And you couldn't market Sleep that way at all. You know what I'm saying? So like they were like a total fish out of water.
It's like how Witchfinder General stood out in that whole scene.
Oh, and like the Nawabum scene.
They're just an oddball. And it's just that vibe. And you can't there's like Doom, and then there's like the subcategory of like Sabbath Doom, which is like a very specific thing.
Sure. Yeah, and I know like you look at some of the bands that they toured with back then, and they were very eclectic. I mean, they did tour with Cathedral at one point, but
Cannibal
I think they
Corpse.
toured with Cannibal Corpse. Yeah, I mean they just like there was never a comfortable spot for them, and it's interesting, kind of turning back to that Matt Pike Terrorizer Secret History of Doom Metal interview. They ask him, Jay Bennett asks him, he says, on Sleep's utter lack of popularity before the term stoner rock was born, here's what Matt had to say. He said, it was weird. We were just playing the kind of music that other people didn't want anything to do with. We were taking Black Sabbath and making it our own. Caius was doing the same thing. I got to give them credit. We were like the two weird twins that gave birth to this whole thing. Since then, stoner rock has come up and died out and come up again, but it's just good rock and roll heavy metal that some clever journalist put a different name on. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of way of thinking about it. And then
that's almost exactly the same kind of sentiment that Eric Wagner had.
Yeah.
It was just the music they wanted to play.
Sure. I mean, even St. Vitus too, what Dave said, like they never intended to, make this kind of subgenre or whatever. It was just like good, heavy rock and roll. I mean, even Sabbath never really set out to be heavy metal. They just were hard rock, blues rock stuff. It was just heavier than everybody else at the time. So, and then Bennett asked him what the early Sleep shows were like. And he says, they sucked. No one was there. Then we quit for 10 years and started getting big. Now we come back and it's like we're the biggest band in the world or something. It's lame, but people don't think for themselves at the right time. They don't explore things. They just want to fit in with the movement. When Sleep was around, that's when tribal tattoos were really popular. Now everyone with tribal tattoos is either on that show Spartacus in the UFC or on crystal meth, or they're dead from doing crystal meth. And that's because they always did the popular thing. So fuck that. I hope I'm not popular. So it's kind of a fun, angry sentiment from Pike there, So, you get the feeling that they never were comfortable in this time period at all, I guess with Holy Mountain, I didn't discover this probably through Grindcore Coon, I imagine, because he was always the sort of guy that was digging a little bit deeper into especially American Doom and Stoner Doom kind of stuff than I was. But I think certainly I knew Dragonaut from Gummo. I must have heard some of these songs on like an earache comp too, because I knew the Druid as well, or that was a song I was fairly familiar with. But I don't think I ever owned a gem of this until probably I started working at New Moon in the late 90s, and it probably came in used or something like that. But I remember Jeff, Grindcore Coon had the cover of Holy Mountain as a t-shirt that he would wear to a lot of concerts and stuff. And so it was on my radar screen all the time, but there was never like a follow-up, and we didn't really start buying a lot of earache stuff until like 94. That's really when like the Columbia deal sort of broke through. And we as like freshmen in high school were like flooded with a lot of earache stuff. So I knew there was this band called Sleep that had been on earache, but there was never a follow-up album. And then I think what happened is when we were in college, Jeff went to MSU and I was at CMU, Michigan State University in Central Michigan. And he came down to visit, or he came back home to visit, and he was like talking to me about this song that was like 55 minutes long. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like kind of like Edge of Sanity, Crimson. He's like, not really. I was like, okay. And I remember like, I don't know if we listened to the whole song of Jerusalem, but he had picked it up, I think at FBC, the record store there in East Lansing, and he had found it there. They used to have a lot of like Man's Rune stuff. That was like kind of where in the state of Michigan, where if you wanted like a lot of that type of stuff, you went to Lansing to get it. They always seem to have that stuff in stock. And so Jeff was like, Jeff was getting that. And I remember Jeff was getting right around the same time he bought that. He found the first like 2 or 3 desert sessions, which basically became Queens of the Stone Age. Mm-hmm. And so he was kind of my person that was, filtering that stuff in. And so that's where I kind of heard Jerusalem. And then I think I went back and eventually found like Holy Mountain probably. But
okay. I remember getting the Slimline promo of Jerusalem. And I just saw it, but I turned it over. It was like 78 minutes. It's like, I just kind of tossed it aside. I wasn't in the space to listen to that at the time.
No. And I mean, it was something like I kind of appreciate it intellectually, but I didn't like spend much time with it. Whereas like Holy Mountain, I could like put on songs and I was like into it more. So yeah, for me, I'm like a latecomer to Dopesmoker. I mean, I think part of it is that and we'll talk about it more when we get to Dopesmoker, but I didn't embrace that lifestyle. That wasn't like who I was, I didn't sit around and get stoned or anything like that. And, that was probably a big, massive appeal for people. I mean, it's the same reason I never really got into Grateful Dead or Fish or those kind of bands that much. Drugs as a pathway to enjoying music, at least that's how I perceived it at the time, wasn't like something I needed,
Yeah.
And I was into like Pink Floyd and stuff like that. And we would drive around and listen to like Umaguma and some of their weirder fucking freak out shit from the late 60s, early 70s before Dark Side. And that was good enough, but we weren't doing it under the influence of anything, so.
And they didn't kind of celebrate as overtly their love of a drug. Pink Floyd was just about the atmosphere, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when you're talking about Holy Mountain, you've got, one thing that really stands out is Billy Anderson's kind of raw production. It really captures this band that's kind of like on the ascent, I mean, no pun intended, but like they're kind of moving towards this higher plane of musicianship and songwriting. Obviously, they're more focused as a 3-piece. If it wasn't apparent, they did get rid of the other guitar player, Jason, after Volume 1. And so now they're operating as, and I think the same way that a lot of the sort of great late 60s, early 70s, 3-piece bands did, Cream and Blue Cheer, they sort of had this like heavy pocket of groove that they could sort of create. Mm-hmm. And I really think in a weird way, I think Sabbath really is the same because Ozzy's not playing an instrument. So to me, like they do exactly the same thing as a power trio, because. Yeah,
you just have that, the wail of Ozzy kind of going over the top of everything.
Exactly. And I mean, even, Hendrix and what they did and how fucking visceral and heavy and volcanic some of those riffs were, especially on, the last like kind of full length Experience record. I mean, there's something about one guitar, one bass, one drums, and that's it, not having a second guitar player kind of mixed in the mix. And Sabbath certainly had that. That's kind of what I was hinting at, that even though there are 4 people, it really operated similarly to a power trio. And I just think this is also, I think, where prodigious amounts of weed usage allows them to kind of tap into this kind of Volume 4 nucleus, this Black Sabbath Volume 4. I mean, I think that Masters of Reality are kind of the 2 basis of like Sleep in a certain way. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, they have parts that could be from the first couple Sabbaths and certainly parts from Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath and Sabotage and stuff. But those to me are the 2 most like kind of stoner doom element Sabbath records are their 3rd and 4th record there. I mean, there's stuff going on like, the sort of riff building elements that you heard a lot more on Masters of Reality in Volume 4. There's kind of the drum solos that you would hear, even like going back to like Rat Salad off of Paranoid, there's a lot of that kind of style. There's these sort of longer dirges that you heard more on Masters of Reality. I mean, I guess to be fair, Sabbath always had long songs. They just did. So that was kind of there in all their kind of tunes, I mean,
yeah,
Into the Void was 8 minutes. There was Wheels of Confusion was like 8 minutes. So, you know, when you get to tunes like Evil Gypsy off of Holy Mountain, that's like 7 minutes, or, you know, From Beyond, which we're not playing, but it's like a 10.5-minute long Lovecraftian kind of tune. You know, you get the title track, Holy Mountain, that's like pushing 10 minutes. And even, you know, so none of their songs are kind of short and sweet anymore. Those days are sort of over. They're really embracing this kind of more open, psychedelic, kaleidoscopic kind of bass playing that Al is really going to, you know, nail on here. There's more like spoken, I call them like spoken mantra kind of vocals. They're almost like hypnotic, prayer-like vocals that you would hear, you know, like a mantra.
Hare Krishna shit.
Yeah, yeah. Or like you mentioned before, ragas or something like that. Yeah. You know.
Well, I feel like this is where Matt actually starts kind of using more Iommi theory and like making a simple, effective, short riff that's just repeated instead of like meandering quite as much on the, you know, previous material.
And he'll actually lay that out in the interview a little bit, how he like improvises, and he kind of talks through the theory of that. I don't know if you got to that part yet, but
I didn't, but that's kind of where I paused.
It's pretty interesting. He's like, you basically do this, this, and this, and then you can kind of like, that opens this up. And I was like, oh, cool. And I don't know a lot about guitar playing, but I'm sure for those of you that are guitar players, you'll understand exactly what Matt's kind of talking about there. But even the fact that the name of the album itself is taken from a Jodorowsky film, which he's such a fascinating filmmaker. You know, I mean, he's kind of surreal. It's often like his movies are often kind of like simultaneously beautiful and often like frightening at the same time.
And like so mythology, they're fucking nuts.
Yeah. I've only seen a couple of his films. I don't know if I've seen all of Holy Mountain, but one I watched during quarantine was his Western film that was kind of like
El Topo?
El Topo. And that's kind of like based off some biblical kind of aspects. And it's just a really interesting film that, like, as long as you're not paying attention to like the plot completely, you can kind of almost like enjoy, you know.
The plot's kind of non-existent. It's like I don't know. It's like it has an emotional plot, not like a literal plot.
Yeah, it's like Argento or Lynch or something like that. Like you're there for like how you feel during it, not necessarily to like connect the dots of a mystery and like come away like, okay, they wrapped all that up, you know. Like,
you shouldn't be able to write a one sentence description of what happens in the movie. It just won't work.
No, and I think that's true of like a lot of sleep in some ways. There's like different people are getting different things out of them, and that's kind of I think what they're interested in. You know, they're not writing hit songs anymore. They've kind of, you know, cut the cord on any kind of ideas that's kind of the direction that they're going to go, and they're kind of just making music for themselves, and it just so happens that eventually everybody else kind of catches up to what they're doing, you know. And so, that's kind of some of my thoughts on Holy Mountain, I suppose. So anything else on Holy Mountain before we kind of talk about the songs people are going to hear in this next set that kind of jumps out to you in terms of why this album is so important or revered, perhaps, you know, historically?
I kind of hit everything I had to say about it, really.
Yeah. So the first tune we're going to hear is the Druid. And I said, to me, this is a tune that really feels like the most obvious, like antecedent to what like would inspire Electric Wizard's entire career.
Yeah, this sounded like Black Sabbath and Black Flag, 50-50 to me.
Yep. It's dark, you know, kind of, you know, mischievous. It's heavy. That incredible midsection that sort of apes kind of the middle of like Sabbath's Electric Funeral, you know? Complete with like Chris just fucking pounding on the drums the way that Bill Ward does in that kind of like middle kind of cool section, and like the way that Al's bass prowess is sort of going in the midsection. And that was one of the things that always jumped out to me when I first got Paranoid from Black Sabbath, is like I heard that before I heard like Steve Harris and Iron Maiden, but I had never heard like metal bass that was like that active the way like Geezer Butler was like in a song like Electric Funeral, where I was like, holy shit, you know?
Yeah, I think most of the stuff, it's usually the bass player's following the same thing as the guitar player, but like an octave below or something.
Yeah.
And when you hear this kind of where it's like dancing around and it propels the whole song forward. Like, and it's not distorted.
Yeah, exactly. And there's like kind of this tension between the rhythm section and Matt. They're like fighting each other for like dominance during that midsection, which I think is really fucking cool, you know? I mean, and Matt's, Pike's godly riffs are all throughout this album, or throughout this song, and they just kind of cascade over you while like the other guys are doing like interesting things. And sometimes you almost like, I said, they almost kind of wear you out because you're almost unaware of like just mammoth riffs that are always there. I said, it's like, it kind of wears you down in the way that like the ocean's tide is just like unceasing, and it just
it's
is
like erosion.
yeah, exactly. It just keeps kind of coming at you, I really like Al's twisted vocals in this song too. They're kind of a big highlight. They're really bathed in sort of like reverb and effects. And
is that the Ozzy underwater effect that they're using?
Yes, I think a little bit of that. You'll hear it on Aquarian as well too, that underwater sort of effect. But like to me, Jess Osborne was really paying attention vocally to like what they're doing here,
And the Beastie Boys.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm sure Beastie Boys. Yeah, maybe they were big Sleep fans. Who knows?
Like that vocal approach where you'd have whatever that overdriven vocal thing is they used to do all the time.
Yeah, they do it on like So What You Want and Gratitude and things like that. Where it was bathed in sort of reverb and kind of effects and stuff. I don't know if you noticed, but I threw in the little intro to Aquarian in the little like 40-second little bluegrass kind of thing. And so that's kind of the lead into Aquarian is this, it's called Some Grass, which again is a double entendre, I'm sure. But it kind of has like, a bluegrass ode to weed intro, and that kind of just works its way right into Aquarian, which is the next big song we're going to hear, where your quote from the lyrics, trapped in a world under leagues of ocean. And this song sounds like that. That's all I can say, is it really like, Al sort of incants that sort of vocal at the beginning of the song. And then the song kind of sounds like you're in this drug, like journey kind of through I called it through like the oceanic kind of sunken place, but like with less kind of like horrible hypnosis, like you get in Get Out, but more like Vitus and Trouble riffing instead. But you're still like in this like amorphous feeling song, and Aquarian is such a perfect title. It's almost like you're swimming through riffs or something like that, or swimming through this song in a certain way.
Yeah, I feel I think all of Holy Mountain has it almost feels like it would sync up perfect if you're watching like wildlife films, like, some kind of like predator on the Sierra or in the Serengeti.
Yeah.
With the slow bits, you'd see the stalking, and then like the huge big dirgy things when they're crashing together is like, two fucking deer battling each other in the woods, like really like primal kind of stuff. I always get that.
I like that. It's almost like, could you imagine this over like Koyaanisqatsi? It'd be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, for people that don't know, Koyaanisqatsi are these kind of radical sort of nature movies that are also about like environmental degradation and man versus nature and all these kind of cool themes. But Philip Glass scored, I think, Koyaanisqatsi, but this could also be there, or like a really fucked up Jacques Cousteau like documentary for Aquarian.
Yeah, David Attenborough or something, or like any of these.
Yeah, that'd be fun. We should do that sometime, see if it works.
Weed's legal, so
yeah, there you go. We used to in high school, we would put on like Nine Inch Nails' Downward Spiral, and we would find this. I think I've told you this story before. I don't know if it was on the podcast or not, but we found some like weird TV station that had like claymation, like Gumby style. Mm-hmm. But it was like Bible stories with like a boy and his dog.
Yeah, that was Art Clokey, the creator of Gumby.
Is that what that was? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we would turn the volume off on mute, and we would just play like fucking industrial, like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails shit, and just be like turn whatever was on the screen like evil. It was kind of cool. We
would do that with like having some of those early manga, things like Legend of the Overfiend and Akira, just have it on the background while we're listening to really obnoxious music.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I did that with Tecmo Bowl, but we were playing video games, and so it didn't like equate very well. But yeah, when you actually actively do it with like images that fit like, or counter fit almost to the music, it's a pretty interesting experience, The solo in the middle of Aquarian, I says, had to be heard and absorbed by Caius before they recorded Sky Valley. It's so Caius-y. And again, this predates Sky Valley. Certainly, like they were kind of contemporaries, but man, it just kind of, the way it like fades into nothingness is so meditative and cosmic at the end. And it just, it's a cool song.
There's even like some like mid-era Judas Priest kind of vibes
really?
to this.
What like British Steel Defenders, or like earlier than that?
I'm thinking that, yeah, that kind of era where everything was kind of simplified, and even when they did twin stuff, it was like real subtle.
Yeah,
it was more kind of like almost like disco-y, for lack of a better word.
Well, and
like
that makes
point
sense
of entry kind of stuff.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense with like how there's always this sort of oscillating groove that like Al and Chris kind of bring to the table. There's always like a grooviness to this, no matter how like esoteric like the riffs sort of get, like you always kind of feel kind of into it still, it's kind of interesting. So yeah, and then we end with Holy Mountain, the title track. And in the interview we did with Matt mentions kind of taking massive inspiration from Al's vocals for his own that he'll eventually do on High on Fire. And to me, it's on a song like Holy Mountain that really shows, because to me, this is the song that's like almost a template for like High on Fire in a weird way. So it's like, I remember being confused that because I got it way more into High on Fire and then retroactively sort of went back to a lot of Sleep. And I remember it was like revelatory for me to find out that Matt wasn't singing on Sleep records. I was like, oh shit, Al's the one singing.
Yeah.
And so this to me is like, and Matt said in this interview that like, he really was inspired because he didn't know how he was going to sing when he kind of started High on Fire. And I got to imagine like a song like this, like kind of is like a pathway for him to sort of have the confidence to do it in that sort of way. But, really the opening kind of 4 minutes is kind of a template for some of the things like in those early High on Fire records that you'll hear,
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
The riff here is cool. It's a pentagram riff. It's Death Row, but it's kind of played around with a little bit. And that was something that kind of jumped out to me. I was like, oh shit, you don't hear, you always hear, Sabbath, being like kind of antecedent for Sleep, but also they were into pentagram. They were into Thin Lizzy. You can hear that a little bit too.
Yeah, this is another one of those songs where I felt like I think I took an edible last night when I was writing notes. I'm trying to make sure these are still decipherable. But it felt like the riffs have like gravity within the context of the three piece of the band. So like when Matt gets a little too close to the drums, it like throws off the orbit or something. It felt like there was this oscillation of tempo where they'd like let up just a tiny little bit and then catch up again, and like these like waves as they kind of crashed into shore. But
I think this song is also the tale of two songs. You have the sort of first like traditional song for the first 4 minutes. And then around that 4 minute mark, the song really quiets down. And that's where like the three of them sort of play with each other. Pike is playing with a riff that almost seems like he's improvising it. And Chris and Al are sort of jamming around that riff. And then all of a sudden it fucking coalesces again. And it's almost more crushing than it was anywhere else in the song.
Oh yeah. The end just completely crushes.
And to me, that's like a template, not just for Jerusalem and Dopesmoker, but also like a template for like fucking like Dope Throne, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like the kind of shit like Electric Wizard will like perfect, or, even stuff Isis and Neurosis do, but this is more in the traditional Doom vein than say what, Neurosis and stuff are doing. But
I think Dope Throne might actually be like the spiritual successor to Holy Mountain.
Yeah, I think that's you can almost make like a leap, there.
If Sleep would have continued on that vector, that's what they probably would have done instead of like them veering off to do Jerusalem.
Yep. No, that's very astute observation, I think. I mean, Pike's soloing is all feel throughout it. He even talks about that in the interview, that most of the solos here were very improv and very much built around feel. And
I don't think anybody sounds. I think I kind of took him for granted with how many albums like High on Fire came out with, and, how Critical Darlings, a lot of this stuff was. So I didn't give it a super deep listen at the time. Mm-hmm. And going back, like, Pike has his own guitar tone that I can't think of anybody. He can hit one note and you're like, oh shit, I could figure that out with like Greg McIntosh too. Like there's a feel, no matter, not necessarily the riffs they play all the time, but the actual auditory guitar tone. Like that's that's Pike. It sounds like it's like the whole thing's electrified and his fingers are electrified. It just has this energy to it not a lot of other players have.
So it's interesting, like, you know, like you talking about Pike as sort of a guitar player, because in that Terrorizer secret history thing, there was a question. I didn't really know how to work it in. And they basically, Bennett asked him, how do you want to be remembered? And he says, when I die, I can say that I was a real motherfucker. I didn't invent the Irish saxophone or anything, but I played guitar like a son of a bitch. So
can't tell you that.
Yeah. And he does have this, you know, guitar god kind of quality that I think is just, you know, so incredible. And you hear it in Holy Mountain for sure, is where he really emerges as like his own person, you know.
Well, in modern context, it's a guitar hero is not something we even really hear about, but also you always think about it as like a technical, flashy player, not like a really like, you know, soul feel player like he is.
Yeah. And I think he's more, you know, I mean, I think he draws attention to what was unique about and why Tony Iommi should be recognized as a guitar god as much as Eddie Van Halen or Hendrix or Clapton or those guys, because Iommi was doing things with feel and
out of like circumstance too, you know, like you could only play so much. So like it's a crazy when you go back and look at some of these like monumental jumps in music or art or anything is just from people having to struggle through some kind of like, you know, impediment. It's nuts.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Limitations.
You know, yeah, and I guess we'll go into the set of music here in a second, but I'll end with one quote from the lyrics of Holy Mountain that I think is apropos. I believe the signs of the reptile master, and so you know you get these like. This is where they're really starting to free up a lot of their lyrics in these like abstract ways that are just like almost incomprehensible. And I think, you know, that kind of that reptile master sort of thing, like kind of follows the band because, you know, there are these interviews sometimes with Pike where he talks about like, you know, reptile people and just like funny things I've seen through the years. And he almost has this legend attached to him of like this band almost operates in their own sort of mythology and universe where like people are trying to break down and understand what the fuck they're talking about sometimes. And I think
there's also a lot of like using like modern, like, cause lizard people, you know, the
sure.
Fuck, what are they called now? People that control everything, the Illuminati, the lizard people, or whatever.
Yeah.
But he turns it into this like Robert E. Howard version of that. Not
sure.
You know, like everything's mythic, especially on later High and Fire stuff. The imagery there is like, it's a total mix of myth and modern kind of like socio-political ideas somehow married together neatly.
And I know he's a huge fan of Conan and a huge fan of D&D. And so, that kind of fits in with what he's sort of doing and stuff. So, but yeah, I just thought I love that line. I just had to work it in somehow. You know, I believe in the signs of the reptile master. You know, it's like, whoa, out of nowhere. So let's get into it. We've got the Druid, the Somegrass intro that bleeds directly into Aquarian, and then we'll end with the monumental Holy Mountain title track.
rising faster. Earth drenched in black, thunder starless sky above. And on the mountain sets free the holy dome.
yeah, from there we just went 3-piece, and we started discovering, just a way more Black Sabbath approach to things. Like everybody right around then was doing like the death metal thing, or like Carcass and like all the earache bands and stuff like that were going on pretty strong, and and Godflesh and all that kind of stuff. And we had this really weird approach, but somehow, like, I don't know, I guess you could say we were a little ahead of our time when we were doing all that, because no one was doing that, like wearing bell bottoms, just being like total stoners, and yeah. And then from there, we made Holy Mountain in different sessions, because we'd have to like borrow money from someone, or and go and beg Billy for time. And we actually recorded that under Anne Rice. Anne Rice had an apartment in San Francisco, and there's this studio, the Razor's Edge, and we went down there and we got that demoed out and sent it to Earache. Earache signed us for a really shitty album deal when we were kids, but we signed it instantly. They got us over to Europe and got us some amps and this and that.
I put my mouth
There's Holy Mountain, Aquarian, Some Grass. Then we open up with the Druid. So here we are, Mark, the hardest part of this whole episode, I think, in terms of how to visualize and do this and set some of this up. And so when you talk about Jerusalem / Dopesmoker, and I'll use those terms probably interchangeably accidentally. So we're really talking about the kind of same thing, and we'll let the band kind of weigh in on what some of the maybe the differences are between them when we sort of get to that point. I kind of talked about my experience with like encountering it, and you as well, that, we both didn't really spend a lot of time with this record when we first kind of, saw it coming out. I think 98, I think is when Jerusalem officially came out.
Yeah. I think I got the promo in
99,
late 97 or something.
Yeah. So 99, it came out, Music Cartel. And I think overseas, maybe it came out on Rise Above. And so,
yeah, cause I remember the promo came out and then we're like, when the hell's the actual record coming out? Like there was never a follow-up. So it was one of those rare instances.
And this made an appearance in the top 100 Doom albums of all time as well. And it came in at number 17, right in between Candlemass Nightfall and, appropriately, Black Sabbath Volume 4. So
very nice.
Good company. And Zach Smith did the write-up on it, so I thought I'd share this just to sort of get the ball rolling. He says, Jerusalem may not be the definitive version of Sleep's third LP. That would be Dopesmoker. But it was how many of us heard what guitarist Matt Pike once said might be the fucking weirdest song ever for the first time. If you're not aware of that backstory, pick up our March 2000. Okay, no. We'll don't worry. We'll go back to that March 2006 issue in a moment here. Just how good is the 52-minute opus? For an album all about weed, from its lyrics to its packaging, not to mention the copious amounts of consumed during its creation, the drug is by no means required for Pike's monumental riffs, Chris's hypnotic drum work, and Al's rollicking bass lines to send you into doom-laden reverie. Sure, lighting up probably helps, but there's enough variety to always keep things interesting. The much-needed acoustic break in track 4, the healthy sprinklings of Pike's wailing solos, and Cisneros' chants, and most importantly, the opening riff that slowly uncoils over the course of track 1 and is continuously unfurled in one form or another the rest of the way. There has never been a record quite like it, and there probably never will be again. So
that sums it up pretty well.
I guess when we were kind of thinking about what approach to take, I kind of tried to think like, what version should we really listen to and kind of talk about? And, I don't know. I decided Dopesmoker because it's kind of considered by the band to be the more definitive version that didn't get so much stuff edited out. So if you're more familiar with Jerusalem than Dopesmoker, like, we're going to be listening to the Dopesmoker version. So just kind of fair warning. So there might be some things that are a little bit different, but I don't think it matters really. I think fans are fans of both most of the time, so. But here's what and I haven't use this for this episode, but I've used it throughout the doom metal series, is the Russian author, Alexei Edokimov, wrote the Doom Metal Lexicon. And here's what he had to say in the sleep kind of section about Dopesmoker. And it says, where are we at? All right, here we go. It seems that sleep. Hang on. Oh, here we go. Oh, sorry. Around 1996, Sleep recorded one monumental song, Jerusalem, which was released as a full length under the same name in 1998 by the Music Cartel. With this 52-minute sonic torture, the band set a new level of extreme metal music. If previously extreme had related to fast, aggressive music with growls or screams, now Sleep's tendency towards an ultra-heavy and ultra-slow sound added their own measure of extremity. The song provisionally splits into 6 parts, and there are even lyrics, but the main riff is recycled by Sleep over and over and over again. The minimal diversity and stubbornly slow pace allows the description of the whole song as meditative. It's all about a twisted pilgrimage to an imaginary sacred city of dope, with a caravan of pious smoke worshippers chanting, "Follow the smoke toward the rift-filled land, drop out of life with bong in hand, follow the smoke, Jerusalem," and other astonishing poetic revelations. The journey is quite monotonous, but the riff makes you slowly shake your head to the rhythm of Chris's drumming until you fall down to sleep with the gentle tune of an acoustic psychedelic section somewhere around the 40th minute. So it says the trio disbanded in 1998, but Sleep's cult followers didn't stop their research until they found a way to release the full version of Jerusalem, retitled Dopesmoker. This time it turned out to be a 63-minute composition built on the same principles and containing the same lyrics. So those who dug Jerusalem were really happy. This remixed, remastered, and lengthened variant of the original track with a live song, Sonic Titan, was released as Dopesmoker by TP Records in April 2003. At first, you may think, who would buy it? Well, TP and Southern Lord Recordings could give you a proper answer. Between them, both labels re-released the album 11 times. And there is also a cassette edition and a double CD for Japan. Dopesmoker is one of the most contradictory and influential albums of the stoner rock scene, and we should simply accept that.
Yeah, I think it's like what Dune is to sci-fi, Dopesmoker is to
that's a really
stoner music, Like
yeah, why do you say
kind
that?
of epicness of it.
Yeah, why do you say that for people maybe unfamiliar with the kind of, speaking of Jodorowsky, right? The weird story of Dune.
Well, Dune is one of those weird things, like, obviously had a lot to influence on Star Wars, but there's a lot of like philosophy and mythology put into that in a way that still seems like I actually read it for the first time over pandemic, and it sounds completely fresh and like modern now.
Yeah.
But I think it's the first sci-fi. Before was like, little morality tales, but spirituality wasn't really pushed into it as much as it was in Dune. And there's like environmental there's all kinds of shit in there, but this feels like it's that, but almost through the Jodorowsky lens, where it's more, the personal journey, which makes a whole lot of sense for, the new cover. It's like you're almost, the whole thing is it's the journey, and then the slow like kneel to embrace, whatever it is, their greater power they're looking for in City of Dope.
Yeah. And, for people unfamiliar with the story on Dune, you obviously have the Lynch version at first, which Lynch wasn't really happy about because there was a lot of like noodling and studio, interference.
Yeah.
Then you had Jodorowsky, who made Holy Mountain, and El Topo was working on doing a version for years, correct? And then it just
there's a documentary that it's like the greatest thing that never happened. Like Orson Welles was going to be in it. Mick Jagger was supposed to be in it. Salvador Dali.
Yeah.
It's just, there's like this book that he was sending around to the studios. It was the size of a telephone book with all these like Mobius drawings in it, and just an incredible, it would never live up to, what they put out there and what we thought it could be. But just the idea of it was so incredible. Definitely check out the documentary.
Which is pretty similar to like Terry Gilliam trying to do the Man of La Mancha
Quixote movie. Yeah.
Yeah, the Don Quixote movie and stuff. It's just almost unattainable. It's like almost
Wells
bigger.
tried to do, that as well and never made it. There's just some kind of like curse on Don Quixote.
Sure. And it's interesting too, because Wells' whole thing when he first got that unprecedented film contract from RKO, the first thing he was going to try and do was Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. And it was kind of like thought to be kind of unfilmable at the time and too expensive. So he did Citizen Kane instead, which, worked out okay for him, I guess.
Yeah. Pretty epic in its own right.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is kind of fascinating how that sort of stuff happens. And then of course, now you've got the Villanueva version that's coming out. So,
well, there's also the Sci-Fi Channel version. I don't know if you ever saw it.
Oh, was there?
Yeah.
Oh, no,
in the early 2000s. I've never saw it. Just in, researching about it. I've heard it's like people saying the TV version of The Shining is more book accurate or whatever. It was like, oh, whatever.
Got it. Yeah. I was just watching Eli Roth's History of Horror new episode last night, and it was on psychics, and they were talking about The Shining, and they were talking about, they had Stephen King talking about Kubrick's version, and he just said it looks amazing. And he basically said his opinion. I don't know if you've heard this quote before, but he said it on this episode. He's like, it's like a beautiful like Cadillac with no engine. And so, I don't buy that.
But
and again, I think from his standpoint, The Shining was like so personal because it was about him dealing with his own alcoholism. And he wanted there to be a redemption story because like it's his own personal redemption. And the fact that Kubrick took out the redemption angle at the end, I can see how from a personal standpoint, King's like, what the fuck? Like that was me. And there's no redemption for me at the end. Like, like he probably fucked with him a little bit, part of it. So
yeah, it's tough to have a really personal story like that, allegory, and then have somebody else adapt it and get something different out of it. But I think that's also, I like that you can take one idea and through different mediums, it can have wildly different, can go different directions than what originally intended.
Well, and what they talked about is, that's one of the reasons why he was kind of so annoyed in certain ways with like how The Shining sort of went down in mythology, that he wrote the sequel, Dr. Sleep. And so he talks about how in the movie version, Mike Flanagan, who did Oculus and Haunting of Hill House, and he has that new series, which I haven't seen yet, called Midnight Mass. That's supposed to be pretty decent, but I haven't seen it yet.
I haven't heard of that one.
But Flanagan basically, have you seen Dr. Sleep with McGregor?
I've actually got I found a promo of it for like $2, the director's cut version. I keep falling asleep.
Oh, really? I actually watched the director's cut version. I dug it,
Okay.
Maybe he's got to watch it not late one night, but
well, the recliner, just knocks me out.
Yeah, exactly. That happens to me too. But basically Flanagan went to King and said, look, I want to make this version that like kind of links Kubrick and it links your version, and it sort of brings both to a conclusion. And King gave him the okay to change some stuff from the book.
It's a nice postmodern idea.
I think that's a really cool idea, and that made me appreciate the movie a little bit more and some of the chances that it kind of takes, that in a way it's like putting to bed all the like controversy around the Kubrick versus King versions and stuff, and kind of taking the story to its like more logical conclusion. And not to spoil it, but like there's finally kind of almost a redemptive arc at the very end. So it looks like King gets what he wants out of it and the Kubrick fans get what they want out of it. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, So,
yeah, absolutely.
And maybe that's what Dopesmoker kind of represents. It's like, the closest we're going to come to sort of the version that the band kind of maybe originally wanted to come out, even if it's never, ever going to be the exact version, because there's all kinds of stuff with different production. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
I feel like, after this came out, I don't know the timelines exactly, but like Sun O seems like they're like if this was like some type of religion, they're like the splinter group that, takes it to the real drone extreme.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you're right on. Here's what Jay Bennett had to say in the intro to the Hall of Fame that he wrote on it. He said, the words stoner epic don't even come close to describing the extreme riff hypnosis that Jerusalem visited upon the red-eyed legions of Heshers, grass pirates, and acid casualties who genuflected at the altar of the legendary San Jose power trio known as Sleep. In 1995, after 2 albums, Volume 1 and Holy Mountain, Sleep bassist Al Cisneros, guitarist Matt Pike, and drummer Chris Haikuas were ready to record their masterpiece, a 1-song, 52-minute album with financial assistance from their new corporate benefactors at London Records. Jerusalem was Sabbath in slow motion, Earth 2 without track divisions, and the soundtrack for an eternal bong-huffing caravan to the heart of the Holy Land rolled into a thick, hazy hour of thundering chords, booming vocals, and terminal battery. Little did its architects know that the album, originally entitled Dopesmoker, would be shelved, and that Sleep would break up years before its first official release in 1998. The legends and rumors surrounding the album's creation are as numerous as they are fantastic. Tales of the band's staggering weed intake, master tapes delivered in skull bongs, and drug-related budgetary indiscretion proliferated, despite, and probably due to, the fact that Pike, Cisneros, and Haikuas never actually did promotional interviews when the album eventually came out. So there you go. That's so part of the legend of this is that it was released in a vacuum where the band had already been broken up and they didn't really comment or talk about anything for years. And that sort of left this like question mark surrounding a lot of it, or it built kind of its own weird mythology around the record. Meanwhile, Pike's doing High on Fire and the other 2 guys are doing Ohm So here's what they had to say in the sort of opening of the interview. And Bennett sort of asks them, he says, what's your most vivid memory of the Jerusalem recording sessions? And Pike says, well, none of it's vivid. I was smoking so much weed that everything was kind of surreal at the time. But I remember a lot of loud amps and trying to memorize all these crazy-ass combinations of parts. There was so much to memorize for that album, and we had to do it in like 3 different sections because a reel-to-reel only holds something like 22 minutes. It was really cool, but it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. I was also trying to make my bass player and my drummer get along because they were having a hard time with each other in the studio. And at the same time, my mom was dying from cancer, so it was tough.
Jeez.
Chris says, I remember a lot of hard work and a lot of stress. We put in a lot of hours to create that album. We had just got onto London Records and we were all really broke, which made things difficult. Al says, when we finished the tracking and all sat down together in the studio to finally hear the song straight through, it was pretty special. It's weird when your entire life is coming back through the speakers in the control room, and all three of you kind of mutually acknowledge that internally. But at the same time, it was like somebody hoisting a flag on a sinking ship. So it's weird to think about making a record, Mark, where you kind of know you're making a record that's going to fail. Like, can you think of like another music or film project that's like similar to this, where like you almost know you're following through a dream that no one's going to care about or accept at the time? You know,
I would say Metallica's Lulu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That.
Which
Way
again,
less successful.
Yeah. I don't know if there's ever been a revision on that. I think it's commonly accepted that that's just not great, you know? Yeah. And again, I think the misperception is I think it's a Lou Reed record that just has Metallica as the backing band, not a Metallica record. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I think that's the fatal flaw in thinking about that. But yeah, it is such a weird thing to think about, that during the very making of something that it's just not going to work.
Sometimes, I mean, stuff when it's too, going back to Terry Gilliam stuff, if it's too ambitious and there's too many, like, too much, you know, fate punching in the face and like weather and everything, you can't weather through the storm, but you got to just try. Like, it's just this, they set this huge goal up for themselves and trying to, like, it just seems like a kind of a crazy task, to be honest.
Sure. I mean, I guess like Titanic, you know, what Cameron set out to do, but he pulled it off, you know, almost. I mean, he spent like 6 years or whatever making that movie, and it just, it came together. It could have been Waterworld Part 2 or something, you know. You know, which I've never actually sat down. I've heard Waterworld's actually better than people think it is, but I've never actually watched it.
It's better than Dances with Wolves, I'll tell you that.
Okay. I mean, Dances with Wolves is so like trite and so like self-serving for what it is.
It's,
you know?
fucking embarrassing. The narration, it sounds like somebody's got stoned and did like their own commentary track over the top.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that movie was good when I was a kid because I was in like middle school and I was like all the awards surrounding it. But then I like watched it as an adult and I was like, this is almost so like white savior. Like, it's just, it's, I don't know. I've seen so many much better movies about that subject done, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's like, you know, he does some interesting things like cinematography wise, and it's like Braveheart.
The cast is fine, but
some cool scenes and stuff. But yeah, it's just not
Costner's good. I don't know. He's not that type of dude that can handle it all.
Sure.
It does one thing or the other.
Now I need to watch Waterworld. So
Waterworld is like blatantly retarded.
Yeah, it's just
Dennis Hopper's just completely over the top. It's fun.
Is he back on drugs in that movie, you think?
He certainly seems like he's doing some amphetamines in it. He's smoking the whole time. Like, the whole bad guy sect is the smokers, and they're they're on these big like ships that are just belching black smoke, and it's all pretty black and white, but it's fun.
Yeah. So one of the next things that they asked the band in the Hall of Fame interview is, he says, the popular legend is that Sleep got a big advance for Jerusalem and smoked it all and ended up having to rush through the recording sessions. Did that actually happen? And Chris says, I've heard that before, and it's certainly not true, but you can't argue with a piece of paper when you read it, you know? Al was always kind of the band leader, so I think an A&R guy contacted him first. And at the time, London said they'd give us full artistic freedom, so that's what we did. But when it got down to the final stages of things, we were all really stressed out and broke because the money we got from them initially pretty much covered how badly in debt we were at the time that we signed. And it wasn't because of the drugs or anything like that either. It was because we were trying to do this for a living, and we had bills piled up from the time between Holy Mountain and Jerusalem. We never really had real jobs either. Matt and I worked on a plastering crew for a while. Al worked in a bookstore. We all just did odd jobs so we could stay loose and go on tour whenever we wanted. But the story that we smoked our budget is not true. I can't say we didn't spend a few dollars on it, but I mean, it would have been literally impossible to spend it all. So put that rumor to bed on the legend surrounding it. But then Bennett comes back a little bit later in the interview and says, how crucial was your collective weed intake in the creative process? And I think this is certainly something that needs to be addressed. Pike says we were smoking a lot between us all. We were probably smoking 2 ounces a day or more. Al says back then, from the time of Holy Mountain through Jerusalem, it was definitely a ritual that got more and more frequent. Personally speaking, I was really dependent on the space I got into when I was using it, and some of the lyrics are about that. It was pretty integral to the scope of my life at the time. The line "drop out of life with bong in hand" was kind of a creed at that point. And then Chris says, I'd say it was crucial. It helped a lot. But at the same time, everyone was having a rough time personally during and prior to the recording. There were a lot of growing up and learning. We were all in our early 20s, and after the Hawkwind tour we went on, everyone was pretty tore up. That's when we really were working on that song. And I can honestly say everyone wasn't really taking care of themselves that well. And that snowballed into the recording process. As far as the herb, that, it sort of ends there. Interesting. Way to go, Decibel. You didn't finish his thought there. Yeah,
no,
it doesn't go on that page. Yeah, so it just ends with that, no period. So there's the lore around the drug usage and things with this record that I think is, kind of important to sort of understand a little bit there. I don't know. I guess, are there other records that are so closely associated with drugs, outside of maybe like Alice in Chains' Dirt, or trying to think.
Well, associated with drugs from the people creating them, or for the people that they're made for.
Yeah. Certainly there's been albums about drugs, but like in terms of like the integration of the two, Dirt is
Dark Side of the Moon and Smoking Joints are pretty
synonymous. Absolutely. But again, that record's not about smoking drugs, or anything. Dirt is about doing heroin. So I think that's definitely one that jumps out to me, but this is kind of the ultimate statement of that, maybe like Bongzilla and some of the stuff that's come later, but in terms of like this being the point where that finally, is kind of created for that genre, this is kind of it, in a certain sense.
Yeah, and weed's never had the same, like if you sing about heroin, it's usually surviving it or being hopelessly addicted to it, not letting it take you to another plane of existence like most.
Not a worship.
Most weed stuff is about that.
Yep, absolutely. I don't disagree. So it says, let's see, a couple more sort of interviews that are little clips before we kind of get into it. They kind of talk about the recording of it and what they sort of remember. And they sort of say, I'm trying to think if there was anything. Chris says it was awesome. I think either Al or Billy found the place where they ended up recording at Record 2. They had top of the line equipment. Let's see if there's anything else there. No.
I think they had like $75,000 in tube amps.
Yeah. Billy Anderson was the engineer. He walked in there. He said he was pretty impressed with the gear and the way it had been maintained over the years. So the environment, the tube amps, things like that, was pretty phenomenal. Then they sort of ask, you originally wanted to call the song Dopesmoker. How did it become Jerusalem? And Sister Noah says, when we played it live, it was announced as Dopesmoker. But after playing it live and after lots of smoking and reflection, we started becoming interested in more of a Middle Eastern desert theme. I remember one practice, the idea of calling the song Jerusalem came up, and we all started laughing really hard. I just put my bass down and walked out. It was such a fucking good idea. It was too much. But now there's a couple different versions out. I think Dopesmoker is the one that's a little bit more up tempo, and Jerusalem is kind of the slower one there. So a little kind of backstory on that.
That makes sense why I would have just kind of, after listening to a little bit of this, the Jerusalem promo, just kind of, it's not doing it for me right now.
It's not doing it for you. Yeah. And then to kind of counteract on that, later on in the interview, Bennett asks him about the Dopesmoker version that's 11 minutes longer. He says, do you consider either one to be the definitive version? And Al says, I don't think the Dopesmoker thing is the exact version that we submitted, but that's the closest one that came out of the 4 versions. If I had to pick a favorite, that would be it. The reason that the song went from 45 minutes, which was the way we practiced it, to somewhere around 63 minutes was because after we stopped doing live stuff and just focus on recording, we kept slowing the song down in rehearsals. We'd A/B it against our live tapes, and we'd be like, you know what? This feels a little bit better. I think the original outtake was somewhere around 65 or 70 minutes. It was much longer. I think the differing musical temperaments between Matt and myself, we didn't have a strained friendship or collaboration in any sense, but it may have begun 2 different roads that may be more evident today. And then Chris says, we all started to have a little bit of different idea about what the song was about. The beef was pretty much between Al and I, because we were the rhythm section and we worked very closely together on everything. And we obviously still do. And up until recently, they don't anymore. But back in 2006, when this interview was written. But because of how the song radically changed and how the communication was bad between us at the time, we didn't see eye to eye anymore. We both had to grow up and get over a few things. When we were done with that album, it was literally the end. I didn't talk to Al for a long time. Matt stayed pretty neutral the whole time, but he was like, I can't wait around for you guys to make up, so I'm going to start a new band. And we were like, do it, man. Don't work at a gas station. That'd be stupid. And Pike says, Pike says, I tried to stay neutral, but I was always trying to keep my band together. I wanted them to work things out, which they did eventually did. And now they're playing together without me. So there's, it's like literally the sound of a band creating like their masterpiece and breaking up at the same time. It's just such a weird thing, Yeah. And so I think how we're going to do this is we've broken up Dopesmoker into 3 distinct sections. I think I mentioned that maybe in the beginning of the episode. And so I kind of just, the way I took notes, and I don't know how intensely you did it, but I did this like a month or 2 ago when I had some more free time, and I just sat down and I just would kind of stop the song at certain moments and write just sort of general thoughts that were coming to me. And so that's kind of how we're going to sort of break this up a little bit is, we'll sort of play like a 20-minute chunk, and then we'll sort of come back and kind of talk about what you just heard and what you're about to sort of hear, and maybe give you just some of our thoughts on it. And hopefully this doesn't disturb the process of Dopesmoker too much, but the majority of you listening to this episode know this album. So I think it's going to be more, and I kind of told this to Matt, I said, it's almost like we're doing like director's commentary on top of like a movie, Yeah,
this is something where you'd go and listen to this first if you're not, and just to get an idea about it. And then you can go and listen to it, absorb it by itself in its entirety, get some weed, have a couple drinks, sit in the dark and listen to it.
Sure. Yeah. And then listen to our commentary if you want. And hopefully we add to it. But this is really the only way we could think about approaching this episode, So, so what I have for like the first kind of half of this first section is that the opening kind of 7 minutes and 30 seconds is, where Chris is sort of doing this incessant military drum beat, which kind of like slowly punches through the introductory guitar riff from Matt, while Al's sort of doing this kind of geezer butler dance. And that's really the opening statement of the band, I think, Then
it's
there's a sort of
tantric dance.
Yeah, it's very, very tantric, very, very Hare Krishna, very kind of mantra, repetitious, raga-like almost, Then there's almost like this linkage that for about a minute where like the song sort of changes. And I said that Al fades away, and then Chris dances on the cymbals with this kind of weird, doomy anticipation. And this is between minute 7:30 and 8:25 is where I kind of have this tracked. Matt even plays a little with this kind of cathedral riff for a moment around 7:55. And I said it's one minor variation, but just the fact that you're doing this mantra, it means like you care about like one minor variation because it becomes very powerful,
Yeah.
And so when you do the same thing, repeat it, oscillating, and then you change something ever so slightly to go into that little cathedral riff at 7:55, it sort of like wakes you up from the trance a little bit and kind of pulls you somewhere new.
They're also doing the similar thing like Neurosis, to where they dance around like the fucking hook for a long, long time. Then they give you a little bit and they pull back. It's this total anticipation thing. There's a real, it's almost like a conjuring of energy or power, very tribalistic, ritualistic kind of feel to the whole thing.
And I think that's really where what Mark's kind of referring to there kind of kicks in around the 8:25 mark. And so the last section we'll talk about, and then we'll listen to the whole thing and come back, is from 8:25 to 12:25. This is where Chris on drums starts to do a relax, I say almost tabla-like drum pattern. That's very, very Middle Eastern, which fits with the themes that we're sort of talking about. And that sort of ushers in Al's mantra-like vocals while he's doing like a tribal sort of African pattern the whole time. And it's very circular and oscillating, almost like hand drums,
There's definitely like Native American vibes to this too.
Yeah, it's definitely, all the sort of stuff you would hear, that do hand drumming, whether it be African music or Middle Eastern or Indian music or native music. And I just said, this is really the point where you start to hear the band communing with these higher powers, these, what they refer to in the song as Weedian Nazareth of sacred Israel, holy Mount Zion. That's kind of like the mythology of who they're communing with in here and stuff. And so that gets you up to about the 12:25 mark of the song. And so when we come back in the next talk set, we'll talk about kind of the last kind of 8 or 9 minutes you heard there, and then set up the second part of Dopesmoker. So anything else, Mark, before people dive into this insanity to sort of?
There's plenty more to come. So
yeah, plenty more to come. So enjoy part 1 of Dopesmoker.
And then we started on making Dopesmoker. We started writing it, I think, on that tour in Europe, actually. And, this is what is it, 1991 or 2 or something when all this had gone on? Yeah. And Holy Mountain came out right about when we went over there. It was like our record got released, I think, when we got there. So we were on tour. We got to play with Cathedral and Cannibal Corpse. That was great. We joined tours with Cannibal Corpse, and we had this thrash show, and everybody, like I said, was playing all this super evil death metal. It wasn't even blast beats yet, hardly. You know what I mean? It was just kind of crazy, and people didn't know what to make of us, but we definitely were impressing the musicians around us. It's everybody could kind of see what it was worth, but it hadn't caught on to the community of kids yet. They didn't know what the fuck to think about it. So, we didn't enjoy success until we went away for 13 years, but yeah, we kind of disappeared and took us 4 years to write Dopesmoker, which was Jerusalem back then. Mm-hmm. And it originally was 72 minutes long, and it got, gradually narrowed down then rewritten to where it's 52 minutes, with edits and with stuff like that. Because putting together something that long and that huge is it's a task, man. It took a lot of thinking, and recording it was really difficult. And I just went so that they could sort their stuff out. I went and recorded a click track of the entire thing, which took me a little while. All 3 of us had to decide, is that the way it's going to go? Can you work through this? And then I just went up and helped. Our film guy was up in this cabin up above the studio, and I just went up there and kind of hung out with him while he edited films and got ready for us to go on the road and all that kind of stuff. And halfway through, we couldn't do it. So we decided to go back we took off from Comchi, so we weren't paying for it. Went back to the studio, rewrote it again, went back and completed it finally. And then, we took it to San Francisco, got it mixed and mastered there. A bunch of us we ate a bunch of mushrooms and listened to the whole thing all the way through. And we're yeah, damn, that's it. But it got changed along the way, a lot of the timing and stuff like that. And, after that album, we were trying to go on tour. We were trying to do things, and it just wasn't going in our favor that way. And we got kind of shelved by the record label because they didn't understand how to market something that was that long. Because back then the formula was you have a hit, you put it on the radio, blah, blah, blah. And then they get big and you make a video, and then there you go. They had a formula. Well, our formula didn't really fit with the record labels or the industries at the time. And it got sat on for a long time. And, I ended up finding a different version kind of one of the things we recorded, and got Billy to master it, and got Al and Chris, even though they weren't doing much right at the time. I had started High on Fire already, but I had this other thing. So I got TP to put it out and give us a little bit of money, because all of us were probably starving a little bit. And then it went to Eric Lemasters, and I forgot what that label was, and then when it finally landed in a place where it was we can actually, Southern Lord can put this out and do this, and we got the rights back to it, and, did everything legally. yeah, the rest is history since that, and it became a kind of iconic album. I mean, people like meditate to that shit and do yoga and
Sure.
like.